Hello and welcome. My name is Kevin Smith, and I'm excited to be with you today to talk about planning for and reviewing evidence-based practices in adult literacy education. We're going to talk about a self-study guide that we released. My name's Kevin Smith. I'm with the Regional Educational Laboratory Southeast, and I'm here with my phenomenal colleague, Lori Lee.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Lori Lee, also from the Regional Educational Lab Southeast, and it's a pleasure to be with you. I'd also like to take a moment to introduce June Rawl from IPDA. June is just a little under the weather, so she is joining us through the Q&A feature and also the chat. So if you have questions along the way, please feel free to enter them into the Q&A feature, and she'll be answering those along the way. So we thank June for that. And again, we're grateful that you are with us this afternoon. So thanks for being here.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Lori, and we truly appreciate you all joining us. We know how busy the start of the school year is, and we're hopeful that sharing this tool will help you think about how to improve practices within your program or institution. So I wanted to start by saying that we're here, as Lori and I mentioned, from the Regional Educational Laboratory Southeast, and we're part of the Institute of Education Sciences at the U.S. Department of Education. This slide is to share that while we're going to share evidence-based practices with you, we are not here to tell you what to do or to mandate you do anything. We're just sharing practices that we know from research should be helpful and effective to implement. So we're here to share with you. As Lori mentioned, please feel free to ask questions and to reach out anytime. We're glad to help support you in any way that we can.
Okay, we'd like to take just a couple of minutes to go through our workshop goals for this afternoon. Those are for you on your screen, but we did want to just emphasize that the first thing that we want to do is give you a brief overview of REL Southeast and share a little bit about what we do. And then we'll take some time and review the self-study guide itself. And so you'll have an opportunity to get acquainted with the document. And then we want to spend some time looking at how that document can be used, how the information collected through the use of the self-study guide can be used in your program, and begin some initial discussions in regard to how, again, you can use that information in your adult education literacy program. So that's what we'll be doing this afternoon together. A little bit about REL Southeast. And so you see regions that are in various colors on your screen. There are 10 regional educational labs throughout the country. We serve the Southeast, and so we work in North and South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida. And basically what we do is support education initiatives in those states. Most of our work now is being done virtually. And so we still provide that support just in a little different way during 2020. But that's basically what we do. And you see that regional educational labs support education initiatives throughout the nation.
Thanks so much, Lori. And this particular session's training, coaching, and technical support. So we're offering a training to adult educators across Florida, as Lori mentioned, with the wonderful support of IPDA. And our contract specifically is with Florida State University. So a little bit about the specific guide. So the self-study guide that we mentioned is available on the IPDA site, and you'll be able to access that. We'll talk about it as we go through. But the self-study guide for evidence-based practices in adult literacy education, it was developed to help providers collect, organize, and analyze evidence that can help improve program performance. So thinking about literacy outcomes for your students, how do we make sure that our students are receiving the best instruction and intervention they can so that they can improve, so that we can make sure that their language and literacy skills are improving. So when we did this, and we'll talk a little bit about the background of this, Lori actually started looking at the evidence base for literacy instruction in adult education. So what were the practices that were supported by the literature? So after we conducted that literature review, we actually were able to work with IPDA to provide regional trainings across the state. And we work with state colleges, with district programs, with corrections, with every kind of adult education program, and actually sat down and talked about the findings for evidence-based literacy practices in adult education, and just talked about which areas were important to consider. So that's kind of where this all started. After we finished that training set, we really got some great feedback and some thoughts from the participants about what these practices look like in their classrooms and in their programs. And we worked with June and IPDA at Indian River State College and the phenomenal staff there to really come up with a set of guiding questions and possible sources of evidence to consider that was incredibly beneficial as we're developing the guide. So we had a really good start from both the training set and from working with Indian River State College to develop some excellent questions and sources of evidence to use for this guide. So as you would, and the idea behind this guide is you would do this maybe at the beginning or the end of the year. So this is a perfect time to actually learn about this guide, sit down with your team and think about what practices you currently have in place and what you would want to do to improve. And as we go through the guide, you'll see how that would be helpful. And Lori's going to talk a little bit more about next steps.
Okay, and so as Kevin shared with us, we did some training, and then we were excited when we went to Indian River State College to meet with June. We walked into a conference room and we actually saw pieces of chart paper all over the walls, and they had developed their own guiding questions, and we talked about some of those areas. And so they gave us a great start into thinking about what should comprise this document. And so we took that, as Kevin shared, and then we developed an initial draft, and we went back around the state and we basically piloted that guide with programs throughout Florida. And we talked about different kinds of settings. We met with people that worked in the Department of Corrections. We met with people that worked in rural areas and urban areas, and they provided us again with some great feedback. So then we went back to our draft. We added some additional guiding questions and tweaked some of the ones that we had. And we thought about evidence of practice and what that might look like. And so we made revisions to that document, which then in turn led to the final document that has been released by the Institute of Education Sciences. And then just a little bit about the purpose and the use of the self-study guide. The self-study guide, we've done several of these for different areas and topics. And really, I like to refer to it as a reflection tool on steroids. So it provides an opportunity for teams of people to meet together, teams that have members with different roles at their institution. And they come together, collect some information and some evidence in regard to these specific areas that have been delineated by research, look at the guiding questions that we provide in the guide, and really begin to talk about what's going well and what might need to be improved. And so after looking at that information separately, that team comes together and they really have an in-depth conversation about those areas that are in the guide, and those areas in particular that they might want to prioritize in regard to improvement. And so they do that work. They prioritize those areas, and then they begin to think about next steps for ensuring that they're implementing something that can address that particular area. And through discussion with stakeholders and the development of that action plan, they can actually begin to make a difference in their program. And this isn't something that's perhaps done once and then left. It's actually then revisited, as Kevin shared. It's something you can do at the beginning of the year and then come back to it at the end of the year to see what progress is being made.
Perfect. Thanks, Lori. So looking at that process again, just real quickly, it's honestly a time to get your whole team together to talk about how these things work from everyone's perspective. What we find from both the initial training that we did and the follow-up piloting of the guide is that communication is critical. It's important that everyone's on the same page, that, you know, the folks who are actually teaching and delivering the instruction, the advisors, the administrators, all need to be part of the conversation. So this guide is set up to help ensure that you bring that team together that Lori talked about, and that you're able to have these conversations around areas that we know are important from the research to discuss and think about ways to improve. So it's a process really that we should do with most of the things that we do in our life. We just don't often have a thoughtful time to do that. So what we're trying to do again is just bring together a tool that will help people initiate those conversations. It is important again that you have people from all these different perspectives as part of the team. So a really important role is a facilitator. So someone needs to drive this process, and it needs to be someone with enough knowledge in these areas to understand the source of evidence that would be important to collect, to train others, at least briefly like we're doing, on the guide itself, and to lead or help steer the conversation, to make sure that it starts, to make sure that there's a plan that comes about, and that you're able to follow that plan to make improvements in those areas that are found to be important. So it's really a way to build buy-in for a process to make sure that you have continual improvement. So the first scoring guide area, there are 6 in total. The first one, and we'll talk about each of the areas briefly, is the development and use of student data profiles. It's really important, and I know anyone who's in this field knows this, to understand where your students are when they come into your program and how they're improving. So, you know, one of the documents that we leaned heavily on was Adult Education Literacy Instruction, a review of the research that came out from the National Institute for Literacy. And one of the quotes they had is, assessing a student's reading ability is important in programs where the instruction is individualized or where growth is monitored. And you all know how important it is, again, to ensure that you know where a student's coming in and what growth they're making over time. And there are several components of reading that need to be assessed. And you can generate profiles of that ability so that teachers know very specifically how to help students. And, you know, there's not one single test that might provide all that information. So it can be helpful, again, to develop a profile like this. Indian River developed something called the River Guide that was a great way for them to collect assessment information. Another important point that came up about this when we did both the initial training and we piloted the guide is that the information that's collected at intake needs to get to the teachers, that the teachers need to know that information. And sometimes it did and sometimes it didn't. But it is really important that, you know, student placement data gets to the teachers quickly, that teachers get actionable data, maybe even student writing samples. You want to make sure, again, that there's as much relevant information for instruction that can be collected as possible early on, so that, again, you know exactly where to start with the student. Another tool that IPDA has provided is the Individualized Instructional Student Plans, or IISP, which is another great way for educators to collect student data in a portfolio. So again, that you can understand exactly where a student may be and what instruction might be able to pinpoint their needs. So there are 2 parts to Scoring Guide Area 1, the development and use of student data profiles. The first part is making sure that you have that data collection process that begins at intake and is in place to make sure that not only you have intake data, but there's progress monitoring data along the way, so that you know you have good placement and that you can track student progress through the use of valid and reliable assessment. So again, not only the initial intake, but that you're able to monitor growth over time. So really that's the idea behind Scoring Guide Area 1. And if you look at the actual guide itself, you'll see guiding questions and sources of evidence to consider when you're implementing this specific area. And what you would do, again, is rate and see, how are we doing in this area? Is this a 4 for us? We're doing great. Is it a 3? We might need a little bit of improvement. We're doing well, but not perfect. Is it a 2, where we really need to think about ways to improve? Or is it a 1, where we know it's important, but we don't even know how to address that at this point? So we kind of have a rating scale for. Okay, the second area, which I'll also briefly talk about, is instructional methods and materials. So we know that there should be a process in place to consider instructional approaches, curriculum, materials, tools, and assessments that's consistent with the research on, you know, not only reading, writing, learning, and language, but adult development as well. Research on the effectiveness of instructional approaches and knowledge of assessment practices. So, and again, There's a great document that we were able to use called Improving Adult Literacy Options for Practice and Research that provided a lot of great insight into selecting instructional methods and materials. And we know right now instruction probably looks very different for you. And we know that there have been some distance learning options for adult education, but this is an area that probably everyone needs to think about right now. Not even as much the materials, but the methods. How are we doing this? How can we ensure that our students are successful with the instructional methods that we're currently using? So again, this one has two parts. Part 2.1, how do you actually select interventions and curricula? That you make sure that you feel really sure that what you're using will show growth, that your students will be able to show growth on student achievement. Is there a rubric that you use? Is there a very official process in place to make sure that you're selecting materials that have an evidence base, that you really are choosing materials that are a best fit for your students? So really making sure that there is a very clear and sound instructional materials review process in place, and that you're really making sure that what you're using is definitely going to work best for your students. Okay, and then for part 2.2, making sure that you're actually using those practices and you're using the materials in a way that are going to show student achievement. Because we all know too, you may buy the best instructional materials ever made for your students, but if they're not used or provided in a way that's going to be beneficial for the students or that makes sense for your instruction, then they won't work as intended. And that's what it means by empirical evidence, that you are using the materials not only that have been shown to work, but they're using it in the way that they were intended to work for your students. So that's scoring guide area number 2.
Scoring guide area number 3 has to do with instructional time. And there are several nuances to think about when we think about instructional time. First of all, are students receiving enough instruction? Are they there for enough time for them to make progress and to see an improvement in their skills? So the amount of time is important, just overall. Then secondly, the pace of instruction. And you see here, again, we looked at the Improving Adult Literacy Options for Practice and Research document, and they reflected that students may drop out if the pace isn't appropriate for them. So if either instruction is going too quickly, so they feel overwhelmed, they don't feel like they can keep up, so they may drop out just because they're frustrated or don't feel like they can be successful. Or conversely, they may drop out because things are progressing too slowly for them. They don't feel like they're learning anything. So they're convinced that they're wasting their time. And so either one of those things may lead to them not completing the program. So pacing is really important. And then finally, the location or the schedule, the class schedule itself, meaning, are there times, is the instructional time occurring at a place or at a time that is convenient for them? Now, this is something, again, that's been influenced by COVID-19, where abruptly all of us had to drop everything and turn to remote instruction. And so this may be an unintended good thing in that now our students, if they have access to technology, can access instruction at their convenience. And so, as we think about that and maybe think about how we can leverage our technology more effectively in order to reach more students. So we're thinking about the amount of instructional time, the pacing of instruction in regard to that time, and then also a schedule that's conducive for those students. And so in the self-study guide, it's really just boiled down to this one indicator. The schools establish a schedule that will provide appropriate frequency, consistency, and duration of instruction to meet adult learners' needs. So do we do that? Is our schedule conducive to our students' learning? Are they receiving enough instructional time? Is, again, our pacing where it should be? Or basically, is there differentiation where it needs to be? And again, your team members will rate this particular area on that rating scale that Kevin shared with you just a moment ago. So it might be something that we feel like we're doing really well, or something that we definitely need to improve upon. And so that conversation will take place after we're done reviewing all of those areas to decide whether or not this is an area that we really need to focus on. Okay, guiding score guide, the scoring guide area 4 has to do with teacher preparation and training. And this is very interesting for adult education because we know that a lot of adult educators don't come in the front door because there's really not one. And so I know Kevin and June and I have talked, it's like teachers come in sideways to this field. There's not too many college education programs to train adult educators. We have K-12 programs, and so oftentimes teachers will come from the K-12 world. And teaching adults is a bit different. And so are we reaching out to those educators that have the skills to teach adults? And so are we recruiting those adult educators that are likely to be successful with our particular audience, who is an audience of adult learners? And so we need to think about that. And are we providing them with preparation up front when they first come to us? What do? Do they just get an orientation that's based on logistical kinds of things, forms they need to complete, this document they need to send in? Or do they receive professional development before they begin teaching those adult learners that has to do with instruction, differentiation, some of those things we've talked about? And so what does that look like for our teachers that first come to us? And then also how do we ensure that we're providing the support that our teachers need and that we provide them with the professional development that they need? And so you see that teacher preparation and training is divided into these two kinds of areas. One, the identification and hiring of those faculty that are most likely to be successful with our adult learners. And then secondly, how do we retain those adult educators, and how do we support them? And I know here in Florida, we are very blessed to have IPDE. They have some wonderful professional development opportunities that are available. Again, webinars like this one that have been produced and that you all have access to at your convenience, that are very professionally well done. You have good support that you can access. And so we are blessed to have that support for our adult educators.
Perfect. Thank you, Lori. Scoring Guide Area 5 focuses on communication, and it really is communication among everyone. There is clearly importance in communication and community building with students, right? Because that's one of the best ways we found through another project we're working on with the Department of Education at IPDE, focused on program retention and student persistence. Adult learners is even more critical than with any other level of education, because you have to ensure, again, that the adult learners are going to come, because typically it really is an option for them in most cases. I know with corrections, it's a little bit different in some of the programs. Again, for job placement and other pieces, there are requirements, but in many cases, adult education students are coming because they want to come, they want to improve. And again, it's critically important that relationships are built with those students. So ensuring that providing additional support services, and in conversations with groups across the state, we found that trying to make sure there's wraparound services for students who needed them, whether it's transportation or employment or post-secondary training or any number of things, it's really important to build those relationships with students and to increase communication, not just in the program itself, which is also important, but also between adult learners and other groups. So we have two indicators for Scoring Guide Area 5 for communication. One is ensuring there's a plan in place for communication and collaboration that ensures successful startup and ongoing implementation of instructional programs. And that's why you'd want to go through a self-study process in the first place, because honestly, you're pulling a team together of people from every different perspective. it would be great to have a former student take part in a self-study conversation. Again, making sure you have educators, counselors, folks who work with intake, administrators, everyone is part of that process. It's really important because everyone has a different process and perspective in terms of what should be happening and what is happening even. And you won't get that clear understanding and communication unless you bring the whole team together and people with those various perspectives. And then indicator 5.2, making sure that there's a plan in place that enables teachers, administrators, counselors, and others to collaborate regularly on students' growth and program success and improvement. So same kind of thing. It's important to talk about students' progress. How are we doing with our students? Is our program in a good place? Do we have a good retention rate? Do we see good performance increases with our students? Are their literacy rates going up? Are we able to ensure that students have goals and that we're helping them meet them? All of those are questions, and again, they're guiding questions that are part of the guide, but all of those are questions that you'd want to ask and will help in terms of your program performance.
Okay, scoring guide area 6 is related to the instructional environment and processes. And so this again looks much different than it did perhaps 6 months ago. But there are some nuances to environment as well. And so when we think about the instructional environment, certainly we may think about just the physical aspect of that environment. And again, this may be more of a face-to-face kind of consideration. How's the classroom set up? Again, we're working with adult learners. Perhaps it needs to be set up in a way where it resembles more of a work kind of environment and less of a K-12 kind of environment. And so how is it configured so students can do their best work, be most productive, and engage in their best learning? And so that's important. And then also when we think about differentiation, you know, is that something that is implemented within our instructional environment? What about the social aspect? Is there opportunity for collaboration amongst the students? And also, is there opportunity to build relationships? Certainly between teacher and student, but also amongst our students, that they need to have the opportunity to work together to form those relationships because they can hold one another accountable. And when we think about persistence, that's something that comes into play when you have relationships, that when you have an accountability partner. So is that a part of that instructional environment? So we're thinking about physical environment and also kind of that social kind of environment. Is this someplace that's welcoming where I feel like I'm learning and it's conducive to that? And so this is divided into 2 indicators as well. And so first of all, again, we're considering more of that physical environment along with the social, and that this is a safe and healthy place for me to be. And so now, again, where a lot of our learning is taking place virtually, our students may be in the comfort of their own homes. They may be at a library if they have access. But as we hopefully go back to face-to-face at some point, we need to make sure that our learning environment is one that's conducive to learning and that it is welcoming. And that's harder to accomplish virtually. And I know Kevin and I were talking about the other day that there are some kinds of things that we need to work harder at making sure that our participants are engaged, that they have the opportunity to see one another's faces, to collaborate and talk together. And that is just made a little bit more difficult by the environment that we're in now. And then again, making sure that we are considering the needs of our students as adults. And so it's a whole different thing for our adults. I remember I went back to college. I was 26 years old when I went back to pursue a teaching degree. And I was in a freshman English class with students that were 18 that the previous spring they had been going to the prom. Well, at the time I had 2 kids and that really didn't much interest me any longer. And so as we consider the fact that we are working with adult learners, we need to make sure that we are that we consider their needs socially, emotionally, culturally, the challenges they may face as they enter our programs. And so that's something that we want to consider as part of Area 6.
Excellent. And one quick story that I'll tell that was kind of interesting about success that we saw from the use of the guide in Area 6. When we did our initial training on adult education literacy practices and we shared these 6 areas, in Area 6, we had one program who had a couple of teachers who talked to me and they said, you know, we really have an issue and it kind of fits both instructional environment and schedule. They were having to float from one room to another, I think every hour or two. They were having to move to a different classroom and all their materials weren't in that classroom. And we've probably all been there before. I mean, I taught secondary schools and we had teachers with shopping carts who went around to different places, but they were able to talk about that when they went back and they had a small self-study group. They met with their intake counselor and their administrator, and they were able to figure a schedule out that put them in the same room all day with their students. So they didn't have to move around all the time. And when they came back, and when we were piloting the guide, they told that. They said, because of this guide, we actually were able to improve incredibly our instructional environment. And we have all our materials in place. We have, you know, a schedule that's working better for us, and our students know exactly where to go each time. There's no floating involved. So it just took a conversation. So going through this process, they used a very early version of the guide, went through this, and actually were able to rework their schedule and their placement in their actual physical classroom so that it worked much better for them and their students. So this is a process we know can work. And again, it's just thinking, how are we doing in each of these areas? Sitting down, bringing your team together and talking about how to improve. So along with our self-study guide, where we have each of those areas with guiding questions and you know, research to support them, we have, as I'd mentioned, possible sources of evidence for consideration. So for each area, what are some things that you want to look at? So for Area 1, for example, I talked about development and the use of student data profiles. You'd want to look at your student program progression plan. Where does a student come in intake? How do you know that they're making improvement across the way? Is there a program improvement plan with consideration for student outcomes? Is there documentation of the assessments and other criteria used to determine skills, whether that's GED or your test for adult basic education, CASAs? What are you using to determine that? Attendance, there are a lot of other factors that you want to consider as well, right? So it just has a list of possible sources of evidence for you to consider for each of these areas and criteria.
We have the implementation majority agreement rating form, and that's a mouthful to say. But what this template does is just facilitate the conversation that your team members will have after they've had the opportunity to review those scoring guide areas and make individual determinations regarding the score. So individuals then will attend a team meeting, and then the facilitator, and Kevin mentioned how important the facilitator is, and this is an important part of his or her job, and that that facilitator is the one who will engage that conversation and will make sure that all of the team members are heard, and that as they go through each one of these areas, we come to some kind of agreement in regard to how, as a group, we would rate that particular area. And so the rating scale is there for you. 4 meaning we're fully implemented. I can't even think about how we might make this better. 3 is we're in the process of implementing. We've got a good start. There's some things that perhaps we could do, but we feel reasonably good about this. 2 would be it's feasible, not really implemented. We have an awareness, maybe there's a seed planted, but there's definitely more work to do there. And then a 1 meaning it's not currently feasible. And when we think about a 1, I know our folks that are in corrections, when we think about instructional environment, for you all, there's not a whole lot that you're able to do regarding that. You know, your environment is what it is. And so things like that, where, you know, perhaps we don't have control over a specific aspect is where you might rate that a 1. But your team's going to come together, your facilitator will help work through this particular template, and we'll decide then as a team those areas that we feel like we're doing really well with, and then those areas that we might need some improvement in. And ultimately, we're going to prioritize, and we're going to pick maybe 1 or 2 of these areas that we really want to focus on. Even if we rate them all a 2, we know that we can't possibly address all of those needs all at once. And so we want to pick just a couple of them that we really want to focus on, where we think that we can really establish some next steps to make a difference in those, and then move forward, knowing that we may need to come back to some of them later on. But together, we're going to prioritize just a couple of them.
Perfect. Thanks, Lori. And what you'll notice too is there's a lot of overlap between these things, right? If you improve in one area, it's likely to affect some of the other areas. That's something that we've seen and happen in our pilot conversations over and over again. So after you complete the initial rating form and you try to come to consensus about where you think as a programmer, remember, your administrator may think something's a 3, but the teacher may say, I think that's a 2. So that's why it's important, as Lori mentioned, for everyone to rate those independently and then come back together and say from everyone's perspective, where would you rate this? So we have what's called a planning next steps form once you've completed that consensus rating form. And you would think of those 2 or 3 priority areas, like Lori mentioned, to improve implementation of those practices. So list them out there. Then we tried to give pretty firm steps for what you'd want to do next. So for each of the priority areas, we have a list of steps. So for the first ones, let's say it's student data profiles. So what are your next steps? So yeah, we are indeed collecting data, but it's not getting to the teachers. So what does that process look like? How are you going to build that out? You have to consider timeline. So when are we going to do this? It's the beginning of the year. It's a great time to make sure we put that process in now. And the person or people responsible. So we need to make sure the intake coordinator is either physically getting that information to the teacher, or that there's some online portal where it's easily accessible by the teacher to make sure that they have it. So think about those strategies. What are those resources that you need to address it? What are the challenges the team anticipates? You know, am I going to remember to do this? Making sure that it becomes a process. Making sure that everybody's on the same page. Then outlining a plan to address those challenges and identifying the people responsible for each step of the way. So that's what you'd want to do. Again, just thinking about those next steps. Then I really, really appreciate the action plan template. This came from June and If Day. So we'd had, as Lori mentioned, several self-study guides, but she really added this piece, which I think is really important. So thinking about not only each step, and the responsibility, what's the timeline, by when, what's the day, month, and year, what are the resources available, what are the resources needed, does an administrator need to approve this, what are barriers, as we've mentioned, what's the communication plan, how do I make sure, how often does that happen, the evaluation method, how do you make sure, what are your criteria in place to ensure that you've met that it's actually working, what are those measures, and then budget, which we'd never thought to add before, but may be important. Maybe it's nothing for some of these things, but maybe there is a cost. And of course, that's what's important, to have the whole team there as well to help build buy-in.
And that action plan template, we like that so well that in subsequent self-study guides, we have included that. So thank you, June. And then we wanted to make you aware of the appendix in the back of the document that provides you with the research on which we drew to create the self-study guide. And this annotated bibliography not only provides the links to the study or the studies, should you care to read through them yourself, but also there are some quotes, and there's just a brief summary of what that research study shares. And so we know that your time is very valuable and that you may not have all the time that you would like to go into some of these studies on your own. So we wanted to make sure that we just, in a couple of paragraphs, summarize them for you. So again, you can be assured that the self-study guide is based on research and that it's there for you to peruse at your leisure. And then you see on the left-hand side of your screen the infographic that we created that's related to this as well. And so it just briefly shares each one of those areas and a little bit about each one of them. And so that's something that complements the self-study guide.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Lori. And with that, we definitely want to entertain any questions. Please enter any questions you have in the Q&A, and I know we've got folks monitoring that. I did send a chat out to everyone. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us. Please enter any questions in the Q&A, and a shout out to my sister who's in our session this afternoon and teaches reading language arts in a corrections program. Very proud of my sister. I'm glad that she is part of this world and glad that I can help in any way that I can. And while we're waiting for questions to come in, I also wanted to mention that we have a career planning guide as well. So in addition to the self-study guide on improving literacy outcomes, we also have a guide to help think about how do we improve career planning and career readiness for students. So that's a completely separate guide. It's also on the Update website, and we have a few infographics that go along with that as well. And again, we're really pleased to provide that resource. It's important too, again, that you think about how are we, once our students do graduate, once they do get their needs met, how do we make sure that they continue with their education if that's needed, or that we're preparing them for a career outside of our program? So that's something, again, that we really try to make sure that we have other resources for. That's kind of the next step.
And you do see our email addresses there on your screen. Please feel free, if you think of questions later, reach out to us. We're all very responsive and we're glad to help you in any way we can. So we will definitely get back with you quickly if you have questions that you might think of later.
All right, so with that, I'm going to show you, we do have a stakeholder feedback survey that's going to come in just a moment to you, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. Let me pull that up real quickly. Hopefully you can see that. And again, it's a very easy to respond to survey for the Rel Southeast. And there's an arrow that you click on. You can do this on your phone or anywhere. And there's just a series of questions that you'll answer and strongly disagree or strongly agree. And you just complete that. Again, you'll get the link in just a few moments. We are very pleased to support you in any way we can, as Lori said. So I really am glad to help you. And again, Lori and I are glad to do additional training. If it'll help you anyway, just let us know. And I know that IPDA does a fantastic job in general and provides great support to you all, along with our good friends at the Department of Education. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and put the PowerPoint back up real quickly just so that you have our email addresses just in case you need them. And as I've mentioned, please feel free to reach out anytime. We're always glad to hear from you. And we hope that June gets better soon as well.
Mm-hmm.